So we are on to our second lesson or second session in this Exploring the Trinity class. I'm glad to have you guys on board for this. This incredible topic, exalted topic. I want to begin this session with a bit of a review. And if you recall, our focus last lesson was based on Paul's phrase from 1 Timothy chapter 2, where he said, "For there is one God." And if you know the rest of that, it says, "For there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Jesus Christ." But that first phrase, "For there is one God," is about as Jewish as Paul can get, right? That beautiful declaration, "For there is one God." And this is what we looked at from many of those Old Testament scriptures last time. I'm jumping ahead. So here's this first slide. Let me do this first, and then we'll come to that slide that I thought was first in line. One of the things that we began with last time was this simple idea. Though the term Trinity does not appear in the Holy Bible, the goal of this study is to show how the concept is wholly biblical and why this teaching is so important. So that's kind of our main purpose statement for this class. That sums everything up. We'll probably come back to that each week. We want to understand how this is wholly biblical. And as you've figured out, as I've been clear about, and you figured out from, as you'll see tonight as well, we are building our understanding, aren't we? We're building piece upon piece, brick upon brick, to understand how even our spiritual ancestors in the early centuries of the church, how they did the very same thing of wrestling with the scriptures and trying to formulate an understanding of who God was in light of all that scripture revealed about him. So here's that next slide here. Last lesson, we learned that God's people, in light of those Old Testament passages we looked at, God's people serve only one God, since there's only one true God to serve. That was clear to us from the Old Testament. It wasn't just functional monotheism, where, yeah, there may be other gods, but for us, we only serve this one God. No, it was a monotheism, an existential monotheism. It was a true reality-based monotheism. There is only one God. We also heard that no one or nothing else is like him, since he alone made all things. He alone is the creator, right? Everything else that exists because he first existed and because of who he is in his great power that he created all things that exist. And then that final point, therefore, in light of this, being the only true God, no one like him, he alone made all things, therefore he alone is worthy of our worship and service. So that's our solid Old Testament foundation, which brings us to our lesson tonight that focuses on the godness of Jesus. The godness of Jesus. This is the next brick. This is the next piece in our puzzle as we continue to move forward. Here's what we're going to look at in not only this week, but also next week. So lesson 2 tonight, but also in lesson 3. This is part 1. Next week will be part 2 because there's just way too much to go through in talking about the godness of Jesus. We are going to look first at Old Testament expectations. Next, we're going to look at the words of Jesus. Third, we'll talk about explicit statements from the New Testament about his deity. We're also going to talk about Jesus and Yahweh and how we see those two presented in the New Testament. And finally, in these two sessions, we'll talk about what belongs to God alone. So tonight we're going to deal with those first two bullet points: Old Testament expectations and the words of Jesus. And feel free to jump in at any point, you guys, with a question. If something doesn't make sense, I'll try to stop and just see how everyone's doing, see if there are any questions, and I'll throw some questions out to get us discussing as well. So our challenge when we're thinking about the godness of Jesus, our challenge is this. If Jesus is identified in the New Testament as God, but also as distinct from God, we need to think carefully about how to reconcile those truths with the Old Testament truth that there is only one God. Hopefully that makes sense to you. If Jesus is identified in the New Testament as God, but also in some way distinct from God, we need to think carefully about how we reconcile those truths with the Old Testament truth we dug into in our first session, that there is only one God. One of the most easily verified things in the Old Testament, right? That there is only one God. So let's talk about some Old Testament expectations. I'm going to give you a series of verses, passages from the Old Testament, and I believe that these are probably the very best kinds of verses in terms of asking that question, really asking the question, what did the Old Testament, based on the Old Testament, what could God's people expect about the one who was to come, the Messiah? So that's kind of the main specific, direct, explicit question we're asking. I'll tie it in a few minutes with another idea that we'll have to save for later, but let's start with a few of these passages here. This is Psalm 110, verse 1. This verse has the distinct honor of being what? Does anybody know why this verse is so significant? This is the most quoted Old Testament verse in the New Testament. So this appears more than any other verse of the Old Testament in the New Testament. Does that make sense? So if this is the one that appears, if this is the Old Testament verse that appears most in the New Testament, you know that it's significant. It has to be very, very important for multiple writers to be quoting this verse. But this is what it says. It says, the Lord, Yahweh, says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. So who's the writer of this? Who's the author of this psalm?
David.
Yeah, David is the author of this psalm. He's talking about Yahweh. When he says Yahweh says to my Lord, who is he talking about?
One superior to him.
Yeah.
His
So
master.
the word is Adonai, and Adonai like Adonai. This is Adonai. Really the same word. Yahweh says to my Adonai, my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. We recognize from the Old Testament context, and the Jews recognize as well, that David was writing about the who?
Messiah.
The Messiah. Yeah, that he was the Messiah. But what's so unusual then about the way, and this is what Jesus used in his discussion with the religious leaders. What did Jesus point out that was so interesting about this verse in light of its author?
Well, it sort of has to do with that that Jesus came from the line of David, or
Right.
something like that. And so David was on earth as a man before Jesus was.
Yes.
And they considered David to be a Lord. But here David is recognizing the Messiah to come as his Lord.
Yes. the Messiah is the son of David, right?
Yes,
He's the descendant of David.
right.
So King David, as being the progenitor of that line, had incredible distinction in Judaism, didn't he? I mean, he is like Moses. King David it doesn't get much higher than King David, but he is calling his descendants Lord. He's addressing him as my Lord, which is stunning. Usually the ancestor, especially one as honored and revered and esteemed as David, has the pride of place over any of his descendants. And yet he's looking forward to this far off descendant, whoever this is, and he's actually addressing him as my Lord, which was stunning. Should have been stunning for the Jews who were thinking about that idea. What does David say in this verse that's so stunning about this coming Messiah?
He said he's sit at the right hand of Yahweh.
Yeah. Did remember the word Messiah? It refers to David as well, and any king of Israel, right?
The
Any king
anointed.
of Judah, because it simply meant the anointed one. So Saul, who preceded David, was an anointed one. Solomon, all the other kings, whether good or bad, were considered in some sense anointed ones because they were kings, they were messiahs. But did any of them ever sit at the right hand of God?
No.
No, that's just crazy to think about that idea. So it's if you when you recognize that fact, you begin to understand why David would call his descendant Lord, my Lord, right? When we would expect that David would be Lord over his descendant because he is the great king of that line, the beginning of that line of kings. So this is a great verse to begin with, because not only is it the most often quoted verse in the New Testament, but it really is pregnant with meaning. There's something really fantastic here that's big, in terms of King David calling this Messiah Lord. And this Messiah is going to sit at the right hand of God, a place of incredible position, and almost with a sense of co-reign. He will co-reign with God. Now let me keep going here. I'm going to give you another verse from the Old Testament. Stephen, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think it's because I just I went to go look up something different, but it turns out it's actually from the same psalm. But when David talks about
Psalm 45 or Psalm 110?
Psalm 110 verse 4, it says, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek."
Yes.
I remember D.A. Carson talking about that. I think it was D.A. Carson, but he was just imagining what would have been going on in David's mind as he's kind of thinking through some of the Old Testament. And then, kind of how Melchizedek is this odd figure, the prophet, priest, and king.
Yes. Yeah. That just opens up a whole other box of incredible truths about Psalm 110 that we don't have time to get into tonight. But I'm glad you mentioned it, because there is there's some really important things that the author of Hebrews brings out, because he's one of those authors in the New Testament that quotes Psalm 110 verse 1. So I'd encourage you guys to take a look at what he teaches about Melchizedek in the book of Hebrews. But let's keep building on this idea from the Psalms about what we should expect. This is Psalm 45 verses 6 and 7. This says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of your kingdom is a scepter of uprightness. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, Your God has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. Now, is there anything strange about this verse, these verses?
Yeah, therefore God, your God, has anointed you.
Yes. So he's saying, to make sure that we understand that, he's saying, therefore God has anointed you, but he adds that little bit like your God. So your God indicates, though, that he's talking about who? Talking to whom? Is he talking to God here?
Are you saying the author?
Oh yeah, I know. I see what you're saying because when he says your God,
Right.
like who's like the higher, he's the one that comes,
Yeah.
or like at least it seems that way.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you go back to Psalm 4, if you look at Psalm 45, it's clear that from the very first verse, he says, I address my verses to the king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe. You are the most handsome of the sons of men. And it goes on and on and on. And really, the entire psalm is written to this king, most likely a king from David's line. So, what's amazing, though, is verse 6. Because he addresses the king, of all the many ways he addresses the king here, he says what? Your throne,
Oh God.
O God, is forever and ever. So that is really fascinating. Now, some commentators will say he's actually then directing his attention to God in heaven, and then drops his focus back down to the king in the second part of verse 7. I don't think that's right. I think that doesn't really line up with the rest of the psalm, because God is never addressed directly in this psalm, and there's 17 verses in it, and all of them are describing the king. God is always in the third person here. He's always, God has done this for you. Your God has anointed you. So it is really interesting that he's addressed as God, and that word there is Elohim. Now, do you remember our conversation last week was in the first lesson? Is there ever a time that human beings were addressed with that title Elohim?
Yeah, apparently in that one psalm, right?
Yeah, it's right there on the screen. 82:6. 82:6. Does anybody remember who God was addressing most likely in that Psalm 82?
The indifferent or corrupt rulers.
Yeah, rulers or judges, absolutely. And they were described as Elohim, as gods. Remember, Elohim is a plural word. So when it's translated and when it's used in the context, and the context indicates sometimes because it uses a plural verb. So if you've got a plural verb and Elohim, you know the translation is gods. If you have Elohim and a singular verb, you know that it's talking about God, capital G. So, and the context, of course, can often just make that clear who's being talked about there.
Yeah.
But
Are
we
there
know.
other
Go ahead.
are there other places in the Old Testament where rulers are referred to as Elohim?
No, there's two passages. There's a few passages in Exodus 21 and 22 that the King James version translates the Elohim as judges, but it's very debated, and most modern translations just simply render it as God there, about bringing a matter, a court matter to God rather than to judges. So really, it's not. It's only used really in Psalm 82 in that way, and it's only used one other way in Psalm 8. Where it says, "What is man that you are mindful of him? You have made him a little lower, created him a little lower than the heavenly beings." That's Elohim.
Yeah.
So it's either you have created him a little lower than God, or you have created him a little lower than the gods, or you have created him a little lower than the rulers, human rulers, or could mean angels. It's very the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, those guys even hundreds of years before Jesus translated that as angels. So they actually just they decided that was angels, and they put angels in there. So
Okay,
those are
and
really
Psalm
Psalm 8.
82.
Yeah, that's Psalm 8, but this is Psalm 82 that we're talking about, where
Okay.
these rulers are being described as Elohim, as gods. The only reason I bring Psalm 82 up is that we know from that verse in verse 1 and verse 6 that the term Elohim could be used of a human ruler, right? It's not very common at all, but can be used of a human ruler, like it may be used right here in Psalm 45, verse 6. Your throne, O God, speaking to the Davidic king, the king of Israel. That could be how he's using it. But what we see in Hebrews, if we were to fast forward in the Bible to Hebrews chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, we find these two verses quoted there in Psalm 45, verses 6 and 7 are quoted by the author of Hebrews in chapter 1, verses 8 and 9 of Hebrews 1. And it's very clear from that context. Hold on a minute, you guys. I'll make sure somebody was Christian Saldana's trying to get in. Okay. Let me go back here. Hi, Christian.
Sorry, guys.
So we know from Hebrews chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, if you read that whole chapter is the author of Hebrews arguing that Jesus is superior to angels. And he uses a number of Old Testament verses to prove his point. One of those passages from the Old Testament is these verses right here, Psalm 45, 6 and 7. But when the author of Hebrews quotes that, he says, but God speaks about the Son when he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. So it's very clear that Jesus is being that this is a messianic psalm that points to Jesus. So when it says your throne, O God, it's very interesting that it's almost pregnant with meaning in light of who Jesus is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So one of the things we're seeing with the two verses we've looked at so far is there's no home run here like see, the Old Testament says that we should expect that the Messiah would be God. No, that's not what we're saying. But we're looking at some very significant verses that seem to be pointing us in a certain direction. We just have to keep kind of unpacking these and trying to see, through what the picture they are presenting to us. So I want to be humble, and I want to be careful about as we interpret the Old Testament here. So let me give you another set of verses or passage from the Old Testament. This is one that you know very well because it's one of our favorite Christmas passages. Isaiah 9, verses 6 and 7. Isaiah 9, verses 6 and 7. Isaiah prophesies and says, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. And I'll stop the quotation there.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Stephen.
Almost Trinitarian. Wonderful Counselor, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.
And that could be what we're seeing here. Before we go there, What if, what might the original readers understand when they heard this? What really stands out to you in terms of our discussion about the godness of Jesus and Old Testament expectations?
I don't know, maybe the government shall be on his shoulder was something they, took note of. Um, and then the name, I don't know, maybe they thought of it more, like abstract.
Well, what does it seem to say right in the dead center of this passage? As I have it,
They were thinking that the Messiah was going to come and overthrow the government system.
yeah.
And maybe that's going a little too far ahead into the New Testament. But to us it's messianic, but I don't know if to them if it wasn't more of this great ruler, this government ruler that was going to come and be their king.
Well, and clearly in this context, like chapter 7, we think of chapter 11. So two chapters before this, in chapter 7, we have the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, God with us. And then 2 chapters later, in chapter 11, it talks about a shoot that comes forth from the stump of Jesse. Go ahead, Margaret.
I was just going to say, so it's very prophetic about the Messiah to come.
Yes. So it absolutely is pointing us to the Davidic Messiah, that the king, the future king who is coming. Now, what's significant here that should be right away that we should notice is that his name shall be called Mighty God. Just chuck the other ones for right now. Wonderful Counselor, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Set those to the side. It says his name shall be called Mighty God. Now, that should strike us at first, but we also have to remember, of course, that most Hebrew names were names that had to do with God. So like Michael, the name Michael is who is like God. There's all sorts of names, that if translated would refer to God in some way, would be about God. So one of the questions that we ask is, what does this mean that his name shall be a name like Mighty God? Does that mean that he is a mighty God, or that will just be his name because he has a good Hebrew name? Well, one of the things that I want to point out to you here is that when he says his name shall be called, he doesn't seem to be just giving names like the virgin, that they shall name him Emmanuel, or Isaiah has other children, Shaer Jaub, or what is that? One of those, Shaer Jashub, and then Maher-Shal Hashbaz is one of the other names that he gives his children. So we're in a section of scripture where there's a lot of baby naming going on. But this does not seem to be about naming. These seem to be titles, don't they? These seem to be titles because look at the next verse. Of the increase of his government. He mentioned government before that. He talked about the government being upon his shoulders. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. So I don't think these are names, 4 different names that good Hebrew names that you would give the baby who's coming. I believe these are titles. And obviously what's so significant is this title, Mighty God. Now, the other ones, Wonderful Counselor, Everlasting Father. What might trip us up with that title, Everlasting Father? What could trip us up there? Well, what could trip us up is this idea that it's talking about God the Father, which it's not. So Everlasting Father would be an emphasis on the coming king's position over the people, that he is like a good father on the throne, that he will, like we might use the term shepherd, right? Shepherding the people of Israel. He's a father to the people of Israel. That's the emphasis here. It's not referring to God the Father. But the term everlasting is significant. This idea of everlasting, that's a pretty exalted qualifier, adjective, for the word Father. But mighty God. Now, what might some people say, based on Psalm 82, about this future ruler being called mighty God? Psalm 82, Psalm 45. Couldn't they just say that Elohim is a word that can refer to the king?
I mean, based on, what you were saying, like, yeah, but
Yes.
but I mean, I don't know, like having other texts, maybe even, ancient texts where the Elohim is used for like a human ruler. But yeah, the title, you know, like based on what you're saying, they could have interpreted as like, a person in a position of power.
Yeah. Well, remember the distinction of Psalm 45. The distinction of Psalm 45 and Psalm 82 is that in Psalm 82 it is translated as gods because it is a plural, but in Psalm 45 it was translated as a singular, right? It was, and it's being addressed clearly to one individual. So that's significant that the word Elohim is used in a singular sense. So it can't be referring to a multitude of rulers. And when it's used in a singular sense, it's never referring to anybody but God because of that intensification, using the plural to intensify the character of God, who God is. And what we can add to this is that within the context of Isaiah chapter 9, if we go to the very next chapter, we find these two verses. In that day, this is verses 20 and 21 of Isaiah chapter 10. In that day, the remnant of Israel and the survivors of the house of Jacob will no more lean on him who struck them, but will lean on Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. So a remnant will return to the mighty God. Who's in view there? Who is the writer? Who is Isaiah talking about when he says the mighty God?
Oh, the mighty God. Oh.
Don't overthink it.
I don't know. Initially, like the first thing that came to my mind is like, Judah and I think like Benjamin, right? Like coming out from captivity, returning to.
Yeah. Stephen, can you turn your volume down a little bit so that I can hear myself on feedback? Thank you. But is there any reason for us to think that this mighty God is not Yahweh? Doesn't this seem to be Yahweh?
I mean, as the original Jewish readers would probably take it, I'd imagine, right?
Yeah. And if you went back and looked at the context here, you guys, you would see that this mighty God is Yahweh. It's right there before Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel. They're going to return to him, to the mighty God. There's really, and contextually, there's no other kind of position to take that this is anybody other than the God of Israel. But it is significant that a chapter earlier, the Messiah was going to be given a name, a title of mighty God. Does this make sense, everyone? Yeah? I feel like I'm losing people.
Yeah.
Okay, well I'm gonna keep going here. This is probably the clearest place where we have the Messiah being described with a title like mighty God, that in the very next chapter is also used of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Let me give you
Oh,
one
yeah.
more. Let me give you one more verse, and then we'll try to move into the New Testament. This is Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, one of Daniel's visions. And he says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, With the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. So we know the Ancient of Days is God. We have somebody being presented before him, and to him, this Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Who is being talked about here?
Sounds like Jesus to me,
Yeah.
right?
Well, for the Old Testament readers, it wouldn't be surprising if they identified this with the Messiah, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Extremely exalted language. I mean, wow. I mean, he's there presented before him. This kind of corresponds to Psalm 110, where it talks about the Messiah being at the right hand of God, right? What's so exalted about, what's so amazing about the kingdom that it describes here?
It says that to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and languages should serve him.
Yeah. So look at the way it's layered: dominion and glory and a kingdom, number one. Number two, how extensive is it? All peoples, nations, and language should serve him. And then what else do we know? Number three, about the nature of this kingdom.
Everlasting.
Yeah. Not going to pass away, cannot be destroyed. So this is huge. This is such a powerful text. But it definitely takes that very exalted view of the Messiah. And it just takes it way beyond simply a descendant of David who would be a military ruler who would restore the earthly fortunes of Israel. We see something really, really big here. Go ahead, Stephen.
Whenever Jesus referred to himself as the Son of Man, is this what he had in mind, right?
This is it. Absolutely. This is the passage that he was referring to. And we're going to see that in just a few minutes. Let me give you one more example of this is outside of kind of the pattern that we've been looking at tonight. But I wanted to give you a sense of this idea that there's not just texts about the Messiah in terms of Old Testament expectations. One of the other things that we could do is look at some of the language that's used in other passages that have promises, God speaking about an ideal that he's bringing about, and we could see and connect that with Jesus, which we'll do next week more so. But I wanted to at least give you one example of that, and it's one that we talked about even from this previous Sunday's sermon. This is Exodus 29, verses 45 and 46. I will dwell among them. Sorry, this is again Exodus 29, verses 45 and 46. This is God speaking to Moses. I will dwell among the people of Israel, and I will be their God. And they shall know that I am Yahweh their God, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, that I might dwell among them. I am Yahweh their God. So the emphasis on the fact that he is their God, that's repeated 3 times in 2 verses. The emphasis on the idea that God will dwell among the people. He will dwell among them is repeated twice, emphasized in both verses. This is in the context, if you look at 25 verse 8, this is in the context of the instructions for building the sanctuary, also known as the tabernacle, also known as the tent of meeting. So God talked about, and to really drive home the point even more, this idea that God would dwell among his people is repeated over and over in the Old Testament. Sometimes it's by itself. Sometimes it's part of a 3-part formulation that goes something like this: I will be their God, they will be my people, and I will dwell in their midst. So I know that you've probably heard that in the Old Testament in one shape or some form or fashion, because it's really repeated many, many times. But when we think about this context of God dwelling among the people through the tent of meeting, the mobile sanctuary, his glory would dwell there over the Ark of the Covenant that was housed within that tent. Then it's incredibly striking when you read John chapter 1 verse 14 that says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt, literally set up or lived in his tent among us, and we have seen his glory. And as I indicated on Sunday, there are a number of other points of contact between John 1 verses 14 through 18 and these later chapters in the book of Exodus. So we know it's just crystal clear that John 1, 14 through 18 is looking through the lens of those chapters in Exodus about Moses, the tent of meeting, beholding the glory, seeing God face to face, the law being given, the tablets, all of that. Truth and grace, full of compassion, steadfast love, and faithfulness. All of that is very clear. So there's an example of how the Word became flesh, talking about Jesus, is described in these terms of dwelling just as God promised that he would do. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. Now we're going to jump into the New Testament as we try to begin to wrap this kind of second half of the study tonight. We're going to focus on the words of Jesus. So moving from Old Testament expectations to the words of Jesus. Here's a key question. During his earthly ministry, and I'm going to put this out to all of you, so get ready to unmute your mics if you want to join in. During his earthly ministry, did Jesus claim to be God? I just want a simple yes or no.
Yes.
Margie says yes, he claimed to be God.
I and the Father are one.
Okay. Who else has a yes or a no?
Yes.
Christian said yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
What about you, Stephen?
Yeah.
Yeah, you said yes. Okay. Philip, what do you think?
Here comes a trick, you guys.
I would say yes, and agree with what Marky quoted. I and the
Okay.
Father are one.
Okay, good. Let me answer that. I would say, did he claim to be God? I would say yes as well. But let me put it this way: if we're asking, yes, go ahead, Margie.
I was going to say, isn't that why they crucified him?
Well, there's a lot of that's probably a layered question, a layered answer to that question.
Okay.
But we'll get there. Absolutely. Here's what I would say. If we are asking whether Jesus walked around saying directly, I am God, the answer is no. He did not do that. So that approach to the question, if we think of it that way, our take on the question misses important ideas regarding Jesus and his listeners. Jesus, a Jew in a monotheistic culture like he lived in, was not walking around saying, I am God. But what about his indirect claims? Generally indirect claims, we could call them in a general sense, indirect claims. That's what we want to explore in this second part of the lesson tonight. Let's talk about some of the passages. And you guys mentioned one, and we'll get to that one from John. Most of these are from the Gospel of John. John, of course, was written probably, at least a couple decades after the other Gospels. So as we know, it has about 90% of the Gospel of John is unique. and it's not material or teaching found anywhere else explicitly in the, it's not found in the other gospels, I should say. Even though Matthew, Mark, and Luke share a lot of material, we can find parallels in those books. John is mainly unique to just John. So one of the things that John does is really brings this idea out clearly. And let's see how he does that. This is John chapter 5. We're going to go in order here in terms of as they appear in the book of John, these passages. The first is John 5, 16 through 18. It says this, and this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus. Remember, this is John writing. This is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus, this is after he healed a man on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. This was why the Jews were this is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So Jesus answers them and says, my Father is working until now, and I am working. Why is that such an important response for a Sabbath violation? According to the rulers, they said he was violating the Sabbath.
I would say because God is the God of the Sabbath.
Yes. Does God stop working on the Sabbath?
No.
No, he's always at work. And when he says, my Father is working until now, I think Jesus is actually talking about the seventh day. There's some indication in the scriptures that the seventh day of creation is an open-ended day, that we're in the seventh day of creation right now in some sense, because there's no actual formal closing to that day like you see with all the other days in Genesis chapter 1. So when it says that God ceased from creating, Jesus is stressing to them, my Father, he might have ceased from creating, but he is always working, and he is working right up till now, and I am working. God is always at work to carry out his purposes. So, but what's significant for us is what John says here about why the Jews were seeking to kill him. It says that he was calling God his own Father. And John says that the implication of that was what?
Making himself equal with God.
Making himself equal with God. Now, this is where we have to be really, really careful, because we're going to see this idea that the Messiah was understood to be the Son of God in a special sense, because as God told David in 2 Samuel 7, I will take your son and he will be my son. Right? He will be like a son to me, he says. And Psalm 2 talks about the Son. And the Son is the Messianic King. So that's not a strange idea that the Messiah would be the Son of God in that sense. But it's clear that Jesus was talking about his Father, talking about God as Father in a very different way than anybody really had ever talked about God. And he was talking about God being his Father in a way that was not lost on his listeners, and especially the Jewish leaders, because as John puts it, he doesn't notice that John does not simply say the Jews thought he was making himself equal with God. It's John's comment that says he was calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. You see that?
Yeah, I wonder if it came off in Jesus's attitude as he interacted with, the people around him. Because I mean, like, you'd think like a person naturally, like in their natural position, how they behave out of that, like how Jesus carried himself is probably so so unique. You think like, oh, there's no one who ever spoke with this authority. Like just like the person.
Yes. Yeah, and I think it was partly that, but partly just the fact that no one really talked about God as their father, apart from a corporate sense, like God is the father of Israel, when he talks about Israel, my son, in several Old Testament passages. Jesus, the way he spoke in the Gospel of John, especially, but you can see it clearly in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He always talked about his Father. That's the primary way that he referred to God. And it must have been very striking and maybe disturbing to some people the way that he did. And John says, as he did that, he was clearly making himself equal with God because he talked about himself in the sense of divine, being divine as God was divine. Now I'm going to keep going here. The next passage I want to look at to build on this is 3 chapters later in John 8. John chapter 8. Listen to verses 56 through 59. Your father, and this is Jesus once again talking with the Jewish leaders who are giving him a hard time. He says, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. So the Jews said to him, you're not yet 50 years old, and you've seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Now, what's so striking about Jesus' response to the Jews?
Well, he claims to be the I am, and that's how he identified himself to the children of Israel when Moses went to release them from Egypt.
Yes, from the burning bush, right?
Right.
Yeah. Who should
So
I?
they would have had that context.
Yeah, and if you look at verses, if you're in chapter 8 of John, if you look at verses 24 and 28, that's part of the conversation that he's having with them. And one of the things that he's saying there is, he says, you will know that I am he. Obviously, the word he is supplied. He's just saying the same thing in Greek, ego emi, I am. You'll know that I am, or I am he. And they kept wondering, like, but who are you? They're asking. You're saying you'll know that I am he, but who are you saying that you are? And then after 24 and 28, we get this statement in verse 58 that puts it in context. It's not just understood as I am he, but clearly it doesn't make any sense apart from what you just said, Philip. When we read 58, is Jesus simply saying that he existed at the same time Abraham did? Before Abraham was, I was? He doesn't say that, does he? Because he would have said, before Abraham was, I was. And still am, or whatever. He would say that. But he says, before Abraham was, I am, present tense. Now, how do we know that they understood what he was saying there? What is verse 59? How does that confirm that they got his message?
Picked up stones to, you know.
Yeah. Now, would they pick up stones to throw at Jesus to stone him to death if he simply say, you know what? You guys think I'm less than 50 years old? Guess what? I'm 2,000 years old. You know, I've lived for all this time, and you just don't know it. Would they stone him for somebody saying that they were 2,000 years old?
Yeah, stone them with their laughter, maybe.
Yeah. They would just think he's nuts, right? They wouldn't put him to death for being a nut job, you know. But he's not simply saying that I'm 2,000 years old or 2,500 years old or whatever. They understood that he was identifying himself as the God who spoke to Moses from the burning bush when Moses asked, "Who shall I tell Pharaoh has sent me?" And God said, "Tell him that I am has sent you." So, brothers and sisters, this is the clearest place in the New Testament, in all of Scripture. The New Testament for Jesus, if we're talking about Jesus, we're talking about the New Testament. So this is the clearest place where Jesus makes a claim of divinity right here, deity. So John 8:58 is probably the best place to be able to bring somebody if you want them to hear Jesus say this clearly. He says it very clearly here, I am. But notice, again, he's not, like I said, he's not walking around saying, I am God, I am God. He's doing it in a very distinct way as he's having these conversations. So I'm going to keep going here with one more passage. This is from John 10, verses 30 through 36. John 10, verses 30 through 36. And this is the one that Margie mentioned and Philip mentioned. Verse 30 of John 10. I and the Father are one. He announces to his listeners. I and the Father are one. The Jews picked up stones again to stone him. So we know that somebody could say, well, I mean that I and the Father are one in purpose, like we're one in one mind in terms of our goal, our purpose. That's not what the Jews understood, is it? When he said I and the Father are one, he's not only calling God his Father one more time again, he's also saying we're one. The Jews get that, what his implication is. They pick up stones again to stone him. And Jesus answered them, I have shown you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you going to stone me? The Jews answered him, it is not for a good work that we are going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God. Jesus answered them, is it not written in your law? I said you are gods. What psalm is that?
Probably it was 82.
82. Yeah. So even though it says it's written in the law, it's kind of talking about the Old Testament. So Torah in the sense of Old Testament. Is it not written in the Old Testament, I said you are gods? If he called them gods, to whom the word of God came, that Psalm 82, and scripture cannot be broken, do you say of him whom the Father consecrated and sent into the world, you are blaspheming, because I said I am the Son of God? Now, this is a very tricky passage. It's one of those ones I always struggle with to kind of make sense of like, what exactly is the argument here that Jesus is making? But it's a very kind of classic way, classic rabbinical way of arguing, making his point from Scripture. What do you think that he's telling them? What do you think? Give me an idea. Give me a guess as to what is Jesus telling these guys? How is he responding to their claims of blasphemy?
Yeah, this is like a really interesting, because I mean, even like in Jesus's other arguments that he has, this is probably like, I don't know, this one's like obviously a little different. It's like a little thicker.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky. Let me offer this. This is from William Barclay, the commentator. Barclay said, kind of gave a, kind of summed it up, paraphrase what Jesus was communicating here. He put it like this. So this is what Jesus was communicating. In the old days, it was possible for Scripture to speak of judges as gods because they were commissioned by God to bring his truth and justice into the world. Now I have been set apart for a special task. I have been dispatched into the world by God. How can you then object if I call myself the Son of God? I'm only doing what Scripture does. So I think Barclay helps us there to kind of show us that Jesus is not really addressing their claims directly. He's just talking about the wording Like you're getting on me about using this kind of language. Why, even in lesser cases like Psalm 82, that's in Scripture, and you're giving me a hard time about the language I'm using, but you're not even looking at what I'm doing, like the works. Because if you read past this passage in John chapter 10, start in verse 37 and keep going, you're going to see that's exactly what he's doing, and he's always doing that, talking about the works that he's doing, and that they should understand from the works his identity. They should recognize him by these unique, powerful works that he is doing, that in fact the Father is doing through him.
Yeah, so, because he said, like, for which of these works do you stone me, right?
Yeah, that's right. Once again, pulling them back to the works. So that's where it's really helpful to see that in the context of what he's doing. And he's just gonna meet them at the first point of argumentation, and not even go any deeper with them, and just say, so this is about like me saying this. This is about me saying I'm the Son of God. Why are you getting on me about that when even the Scriptures calls these guys, these rulers, gods? So I think that's the way that Jesus is doing it. What I want you guys to see is that from these passages in John, I want you to see that, number one, Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. The Son of God. So not just Son of God as Messiah, which he was, and how they understood Son of God, but he was the Son of God, this very special relationship, something bigger than they were thinking. It's a claim that implied equality with God. He's of the same kind as God, right? He's God. If I give birth to a human being, if I give birth to a son, he's a human being like I'm a human being. The Son is the same as the Father. They are both God. Not two gods, but they are both God. That's their kind. That's what they are. Jesus, number 3, Jesus claimed to be the Old Testament's I am. Number 4, Jesus claimed a oneness with God. A oneness with God, point 5, that was, like in the other episodes, considered to be blasphemous. He wasn't just saying, I'm one with God in purpose, but he said, I am one with God in a way that was considered to be blasphemous. So in all these passages, John 5, John 8, John 10, we have these ideas right here. Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, a claim that implied equality with God. Jesus claimed to be the Old Testament's I am. Jesus claimed a oneness with God that was considered to be blasphemous. Now, with those ideas in mind, let me give you one more. Let me offer you this idea. Notice that in all of these passages, Jesus does not offer a repudiation of these charges. He doesn't say something like, of course I'm not God, nor am I equal with God. You're misunderstanding me. Right? If he wanted to say that, he would have said that. If he was not God and he was a faithful Jew, he would have been as clear as he could to make it that point, get that point across, that he's not God, that he's not equal with God, that they were misunderstanding his words. He doesn't do that. Jesus always tries to clarify for them the special relationship that he has with the Father and how his works confirm that special relationship. So I think that's really important to see how Jesus interacts with his critics. Let me give you one more passage in light of everything we saw from John. Let's go to one of the synoptic gospels. This is Mark 14. We are uniquely ready to read this as our final passage because we've come from the Old Testament. We've looked at John and listen to this exchange when Jesus is on trial hours before his crucifixion. Again, the high priest asked him, Jesus, are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? Now stop right there. Stop right there.
What verse is that, Pastor?
That's 61 of Mark 14.
Thank you.
It's the end. Sorry, skip over a phrase. It's the middle of that verse. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Now, if we stop there for a minute, what's so interesting about what the high priest says there?
Because he's been saying that the whole time.
Well, no. What does he recognize about the Messiah? That the Messiah is
Well, he's
Son of
asking
the
him.
blessed, Son of God.
I'm not sure.
what?
Like later.
Well, notice he calls the Messiah the Son of the Blessed, right?
Asking him if he.
No. All I'm pointing out is that the Jews understood that the Messiah would be the Son of God, in the sense that he was adopted by God from the Davidic line. So, Son of God, in many places in the New Testament, Son of God has nothing to do with deity. It has to do with being a son of David, the Messiah. So you just have to keep that in mind, because even the Jews, like the high priest here, recognizes that. He calls him "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" That's what he's asking him. Those two things mean the same thing. Okay? So verse 62, and Jesus said, "I am." There's that phrase, ego eimi, even though he's not speaking Greek here. "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all, the whole Sanhedrin, the whole council, condemned him as deserving death. Now, what passage is Jesus referring to here?
Daniel, I'd imagine, right?
Yeah, Daniel 7, where it talked about. Now, he's got kind of a composite here, because Daniel 7 does not refer to the right hand. Psalm 110 does. So he's blended that in. He talks about being seated at the right hand of God. He calls himself the Son of Man, talks about coming with the clouds of heaven. Who most of the time that the Old Testament speaks about someone coming on clouds, who is being referred to?
Is it Gabriel?
No, it's God. God, over and over in the Psalms, Exodus, all sorts of places, it talks about him coming on the clouds. He rode a cloud when he came. There's just many passages that speak about God coming on clouds. And he's usually coming in judgment, which seems to be the exact import of what Jesus is saying here. But if we know from Daniel 7 that it talks about one coming with the clouds of heaven, it was seen, but that was within a vision that Daniel was seeing, the vision of this Son of Man character coming before the Ancient of Days on clouds. Jesus says, "You're going to see me coming with the clouds of heaven." So not only we know that these guys understood what he was saying, because they know he's not simply saying he's the Messiah. They understand that he's saying that he will be at the right hand and he will be coming on with the clouds of heaven. That these are claims that are way bigger than their understanding of the Messiah, right? They call, verse 64, they call what he just said what?
Blasphemy.
Blasphemy. Yeah, blasphemy. So you guys have done a great job tonight, because these are not easy passages to kind of work through. They're not just like cookies on the lowest shelf, like, "Oh, here, I'll give you some of those next week." This is a little bit harder, the way that we've worked through this, but I think that we've been careful and we've tried to do a good job at what we've worked through tonight. And I'll ask you this in terms of summarizing. Give me a real quick answer. What stood out to you in this lesson regarding the godness of Jesus? Anything really strike you?
It's just like a great reminder of how, complex, intricate the penmanship of God is.
Yeah, and I love that emphasis, Stephen. I'm guessing others saw that too. of how interconnected these passages really are. That these same themes and sometimes explicit quotes of passages that we already looked at, how they're all kind of tied together. So here's the summary I would give for tonight. The Old Testament spoke of a Messiah coming who was both the Son of David and the Son of Man. As such, he would be incomparably exalted. Jesus not only identified himself as this Messiah, but also confirmed just how exalted his identity was as God the Son. So the Old Testament spoke of a Messiah coming who was both the Son of David and the Son of Man. As such, he would be incomparably exalted. Jesus not only identified himself as this Messiah, but he also confirmed just how exalted his identity was as God the Son. And that's what we're really going to unpack more of next week with some really explicit passages from the whole New Testament. And then we're gonna look at some other things too that I think will really seal the deal in terms of making it clear about the deity of Jesus Christ. Let me leave you with this heart check idea, this question. The passages in this lesson tonight regularly emphasized Jesus' role as both king/Lord and judge. How should those implied ideas of authority and accountability shape our everyday lives, even the way we share Jesus with others? Any quick thoughts on that as we wrap up?
Reverence and like humility.
Absolutely. Reverence, humility, good. Well, I would just add that as Stephen talked about reverence and humility, I would emphasize too the idea of submission, right? That we number one have to fight with this kind of impulse inside of us to live our lives in a self-sufficient kind of way, being in control. But then that's not helped by our culture, is it? By the world around us that would tempt us to see God and Jesus as kind of there to serve our needs, rather than when we think about Christ as both King and Judge. It should greatly, humble us and drive us to submission to say, what do you want, God? You're in control. And even as we share that with other people, we do want to emphasize the grace, the love, the mercy of Jesus. But we also want to make sure that they know that all authority in heaven and earth is his, right? There's a day, as Paul told the Athenians, that there is a day that God is set to judge the world, and he's appointed a man to do that job of judgment, and he's furnished proof of his appointment of that man by raising that man from the dead. That's not always the way that we talk about things with people when we share our faith, but we want to be real clear about that Jesus is Lord, and you can either bow now, which you should, because it's the very best path. It's full of incredible things and flowing from the heart of God, or you will bow later, and as you face judgment. That is part of the news that we are called to declare, and this exalted picture of Jesus that we've got from some of the verses tonight, I think really drives that home.